Last Christmas Eve, my daughter-in-law Jessica called me and said, "Walter, we've decided to have a small, intimate Christmas this year. Just immediate family." You understand. What Jessica didn't understand was that the house she was banning me from was actually mine. I've been letting my son and his family live there rent-free for 3 years. 2 days after Christmas, I put the house on the market. 6 weeks later, Jessica and my son were scrambling to find a new place to live while I counted the $340,000 from the sale. Sometimes the best Christmas gift you can give yourself is freedom from ungrateful family members. This is the story of how being banned from Christmas dinner cost my son and his wife the roof over their heads and taught them that immediate family includes the man who owns the house. Immediate family includes the man who owns the house. Walter. My name is Walter Brennan, and I'm a 71-year-old retired contractor who spent 40 years building houses for other people before I finally built the perfect one for myself. After my wife Margaret died 5 years ago, I found myself rattling around in a 4-bedroom house that was too big for one person. Walter. My son Danny had been struggling financially ever since he married Jessica 8 years ago. Danny's a good kid, works hard as an electrician, never asks for handouts, and tries to do right by his family. But Jessica has expensive tastes and a talent for spending money faster than Danny can make it. Walter. 3 years ago, Danny and Jessica were facing eviction from their apartment. They had 2 young kids, Emma and Jake, and nowhere to go. Jessica was pregnant with their 3rd child, and Danny was working double shifts just to keep up with the bills. Walter. That's when I made what I thought was a generous offer. I told Danny that he and his family could move into my house rent-free, while I moved into the small guest cottage in the backyard. It would give them time to get back on their feet financially, and I'd get to be close to my grandchildren. Walter. The arrangement worked well at first. Danny was grateful for the help. The kids loved having Grandpa right next door, and even Jessica seemed appreciative. I helped with babysitting, yard work, and home repairs. It felt like we were a real family. Walter. But as time went on, Jessica started treating my generosity like an entitlement. She'd make comments about how the house needed updating, how the kitchen was too small, how the neighborhood wasn't quite what she'd hoped for. She seemed to forget that she was living in my house for free. Walter. Jessica also started making rules about my access to the house. She'd say things like, "Walter, could you call before you come over? We need our privacy." Or, "Walter, the kids are napping, so maybe you could visit later." Gradually, I was being pushed out of my own home. For most of my life, I measured a good day by what I could build with my hands. 40 years as a contractor will do that to a man. You start to see problems as lumber and fasteners, headaches as blueprints you just haven't sketched yet. I framed out subdivisions in July heat, fixed roofs in January sleet, and put more kitchens into this town than I can remember. When Margaret was alive, I used to tell her that wood behaves better than people straighten it, shim it, generally stays put. People you help have a way of warping when the weather changes. After she passed, the house we built together became too quiet to live in and too full of memories to walk away from. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, oak cabinets I'd milled from surplus boards, a front porch that faced the sunset just right. The kind of place built for stockings on the banister and muddy cleats piled by the back door. I kept it orderly the way she liked, clean gutters, tuned furnace, smoke alarms with fresh batteries, but it echoed. I'd catch myself setting a second plate on the counter out of habit, and then slide it back into the cabinet before the kettle finished. It's his thought my son Danny was never lazy, but he never caught lucky either. He worked his way up in the trades as an electrician, honest and reliable. The kind of guy who shows up 10 minutes early and leaves the job site cleaner than he found it. Then he fell in love with Jessica. She has the sort of shine that photographs. Love, big smile, big expectations, a taste for the version of life you see on magazine covers in dentists' offices. At first, I figured opposites might balance. He was steady. She was sparkle. I wanted to believe that was enough. I watched the math of their marriage fail to pencil out. New baby, then another, then a third on the way. Danny took over time and side work. The money left as quickly as it came. I have no interest in counting another adult's receipts, but you don't spend 4 decades quoting jobs without learning to smell the difference between need and want. Their musts sounded an awful lot like nice-to-haves decor that turned over every season. Boutique strollers that cost more than my first car. Subscriptions to experiences that never lasted beyond the free trial glow. Meanwhile, their landlord grew tired of late promises and sticky notes on the fridge, reminding them to call about the water bill. I made the offer the day. Danny's voice shook on the phone, telling me the eviction notice had arrived, simple, practical. And I thought, temporary. Move into the main house. I'll take the guest cottage out back. No rent. You pay the utilities, and you use the breathing room to get square. It wasn't a sacrifice, not in the way some people think. I had built that cottage with my own 2 hands a decade earlier, a simple 1-bedroom with a potbelly stove and enough. Light to keep a man from feeling boxed in. Downsizing meant shorter walks for aching knees and a workshop even closer than before. More than anything, it meant my grandchildren could run down the stone path and burst through the cottage door without anyone buckling them into a car seat. That mattered not at first. The arrangement ran like a well-oiled hinge. Danny said, "Thank you," with his hands. He replaced a fence board before I asked. He carried my groceries up the steps. He swept out the gutters after the first fall storm and left the ladder in the garage the way I taught him when he was 10 rungs facing out, feet dry and clean. The kids made this old place feel alive again. Emma learned to ride her bike in the cul-de-sac. Jake discovered worms with the same seriousness some men reserve for tax law. Little Sarah slept on my chest on Sunday afternoons while football growled softly from the cottage radio. Even Jessica, at the beginning, had a softness to her voice when she'd bring over a casserole from a recipe she saw online. We were not a perfect unit, but we felt like one. I put things in writing out of habit. Not Elise never felt right. To hand my son a stack of legalese, but a single sheet with bullet points written at my kitchen table with a dull pencil. Utilities on your meter. Lawn on me. House rules simple and few. Keep Margaret's keepsakes undisturbed. Consult before major changes. Remember, this is still my house, even if I'm sleeping 20 steps away. We both signed it. Not because I didn't trust him, but because clear. Lines keep good people from tripping over each other in the dark. Then came the creep. It never starts big. First, it was the entry rug replaced because it didn't match a color palette Jessica found online. Then, it was Margaret's teacups, temporarily. Boxed to make room for a shelf of minimalist ceramics that looked expensive and felt weightless in the hand. The family photos lining the hallway shrank to a single tasteful gallery grid of black frames. It was always framed as improvement, never as erasure. I let it slide because the sound of small feet on hardwood is worth more than any rug I've ever owned. The first hard edge appeared when I knocked, as I always did, and Jessica asked if I could call before I came by. Privacy, she said. Routine, she said. She wanted the kids napping without interruption, dinner without Grandpa popping in, mornings without my footsteps on the porch, reasonable in doses. Except I wasn't a neighbor dropping by. I was the man who had hung the door she was answering. I started calling, then scheduling, then waiting for windows of permission in the home I had paid for board by board. I kept up my end of the bargain without complaint. Property taxes, drafted from my account on time. Roof, inspected and patched. After the nor'easter, I bought the shingles and climbed the ladder myself with Danny footing it out of stubborn pride. HVAC tuned in the shoulder season, filters replaced on a schedule written on the furnace with a Sharpie like I'd done. Since the day we moved in, repairs were the kind of conversation I speak fluently. What I didn't prepare for was the grammar of gratitude turning into the tense of entitlement. I saw the bank accounts from the distant fathers are allowed, not the numbers, but the patterns. New furniture showing up when the old still held. Shape. Seasonal decor that arrived in crates and left for the garage in sorrowful plastic bins. Memberships to places that took the kids away from the yard I'd kept safe for them. Meanwhile, whenever next month came around, savings still hadn't. I suggested they take a hard look at priorities. Then took a softer tone when I saw Danny's jaw tighten in the way men do when they're ashamed and trying not to show it. I kept my criticism tucked behind my molars and swallowed it with my coffee. My workshop behind the cottage has always been where I go when words refuse to behave. Bird shavings on the floor, the smell of linseed oil, the click of a caliper measuring something true. It's where I made Emma's doll cradle and Jake's step stool and the little wooden animal Sarah gnawed on when her gums hurt. It's also where Margaret's handwriting lived on scrawled measurements and a lopsided heart she drew on the pegboard the day we finished hanging my chisels. I did not write that in the bullet points, but I thought the sanctity of certain rooms was obvious when Jessica began talking about flow and functional family spaces. I heard what she meant even if she didn't say it plain. The workshop would make an excellent playroom in the language of magazines that show families who do not own hammers. I said no with the kind of firm that tries not to be unkind. That conversation left a hairline fracture that ran through everything else. After, it is a peculiar ache to realize a person will acknowledge your generosity and still plan to pave right over it. I am not blameless in any of this. I let small slights stack like offcuts near the saw, telling myself I'd address the pile when it was bigger and therefore more worth the trouble. I gave grace past the point where it felt like grace and started to feel like surrender. I told myself that the kids were the point and that my comfort could be collateral. I told myself that time would settle rough edges the way it does fresh concrete on a warm day. Instead, the edges sharpened not by the fall of that third year. The house told me truths in little ways. The family calendar on the fridge no longer included my name on Sundays. The Wi-Fi password changed, and I learned it secondhand. Packages arrived with Jessica's name on them like the house had a new maiden name. I kept mowing the lawn with the old walk behind it still cut straight, and I waved to my grandchildren as they pressed their hands to the glass. I waved to Jessica too, and sometimes she waved back Dot in December. I pulled the lights from the storage bins in the garage and ran them along the eaves, the way I always had warm, white, clean lines. None of this blinking amusement park nonsense. I found the wooden star Margaret and I had made from scrap trim the year the budget was tight, and I hung it above the porch like a promise. I set the tree stand in the living room and wheeled the bins with ornaments to the corner where we'd then always put them. I told Danny I'd be there to help with the tree, the way a grandfather says I love you without making a speech. He said he'd let me know when, then stopped replying to the rest of my messages that night. The next morning, the tree was up without me Dot at 71. I am not interested in drama. I am interested in clear lines and clean exits. I had given my son a home, not a deed. I had offered time, not infinity. I had asked for respect, not reverence. What I got, slowly, and then all at once, was a reminder that wood will hold its shape if you store it right. But people left too long in the comfort of someone else's generosity sometimes forget to read the grain. I did not yet know the sentence Jessica would deliver on Christmas Eve, but the paragraph had been writing itself for months. All that remained was a period. Walter, Over the past year, Jessica's attitude toward me had become increasingly hostile. She'd make comments about how I was always underfoot and how she needed space to raise her family. She seemed to view me as an intrusion rather than the homeowner who's letting them live there for free. Walter, Jessica started redecorating the house without asking my permission. She painted over the wallpaper that Margaret had chosen, rearranged furniture, and even threw away some of Margaret's belongings that she said were cluttering up the space. Walter, when I objected to her throwing away Margaret's things, Jessica said, "Walter, you need to let go of the past. This is our home now, and we need to make it work for our family." She actually called it our home as if she owned it. Walter, Danny was caught in the middle, trying to keep peace between his wife and his father. When I'd complain about Jessica's behavior, Danny would say, "Dad, she's just trying to make a nice home for the kids. Can't you try to be more understanding?" Walter, the breaking point came last summer when Jessica announced that she was converting my old workshop into a playroom for the kids. The workshop was where I kept all my tools, my woodworking equipment, and the projects I'd been working on since retirement. "Walter," Jessica said, "Walter, you're not using the workshop anyway, and the kids need a place to play. We're going to clean it out and put in some toys and games." She was planning to throw away 40 years' worth of tools and equipment without even asking. "Walter, I told Jessica that the workshop was off limits, that it was my space in my house." Her response was, "Walter, you need to be realistic. You live in the cottage now. The main house is for Danny and the kids. You can't expect us to tiptoe around your old stuff forever." Walter, that's when I realized that Jessica didn't see me as the generous father-in-law who was helping his family. She saw me as an obstacle to her complete control over what she now considered her house. It didn't turn overnight. Control creeps in like ivy looks pretty from a distance. Then, one morning you realize the brick underneath can't breathe dot. It began with the calendar. Our family Sundays, a standing date for pancakes and yard soccer, slipped off the fridge magnet and into Jessica's phone, where they started losing to birthday brunches and influencer pop-ups across town. She'd smile and say next weekend, "We'll be better, Walter." Then post photos from a rooftop patio with captions about self-care. I told myself it was a season. Seasons end dot. Next came the knock. I'd always given a courtesy tap before walking into my own kitchen, a habit Margaret loved, but now the courtesy hard morphed into a requirement. "Please text before coming over." The kids have a rhythm that gets thrown off. I started texting, from the walkway, then from the cottage, then sometimes from the grocery store to lock in a time slot like I was booking a delivery window. If I was 5 minutes early, I waited on the porch until the time hit, feeling foolish with a bag of oranges in my hands like contraband. Jessica's edits multiplied. The entry bench I built from reclaimed joists disappeared. In its place came a narrow console table you couldn't sit on without losing blood. Margaret's quilt stitched by her mother, hung in the hall for 20 years, migrated to a plastic bin in the garage. Jessica called it heavy. She meant aesthetically. When I asked where the handplane I'd mounted above the mantel was, she said the kids could bump into it. The handplane had hung 5 feet above any child's reach since 1999. I started finding my name on things that never needed it. My old coffee mug, the one with the one enamel lip, moved to a labeled cubby in the pantry. Grandpa's mug, using cottage. Same with the raincoat I kept on the back hall hook. Grandpa's coat police store in cottage. The hallway hook itself disappeared a week later. The wall looked cleaner, but getting drenched at the door did not dot the Wi-Fi password changed without me. Not a crisis in itself. New modem, new password, but it was the way I learned it. From Emma, whispering to me in the yard like it was a secret she shouldn't share. Jessica hadn't meant anything by it, Danny said. He'd forgotten to pass it along. I shrugged, wrote it on the inside of my notebook like a schoolboy, and felt foolish again. Packages started arriving with instructions. Black lettering, fragile. In a tidy font, Jessica's things. Do not open. Deliveries used to be community events. We'd slice the tape, lift the lid, and react to what life brought. Now boxes stacked like a retaining wall, and when I offered to carry them inside, Jessica would appear at the threshold and say, "We've got it. Walter, thanks," and close the door on my hands. The backyard, the only square of earth I know better than my own bones, grew rules. No projects on the patio. No sanding during nap. No hose after 7. Neighbors. I owned the lot line, the fence, the hose. Still, I rolled it up before sunset and went inside early on hot evenings, while the cicadas were just tuning up. Then came the workshop conversation, and that was the first time I felt the temperature really drop. Jessica pitched it like a TED Talk. Mental load, child development, dedicated play zones. She had a mood board and a Pinterest folder. I had pegboard and a bench with Margaret's initials carved at the underside lip where no one but me would ever look. I said no kindly, then firmly, then plainly. It's not a storage shed. It's my space. What I didn't say was, it's the only room left where I can breathe like a husband instead of a houseguest around Halloween. I noticed a new door policy. The deadbolt turned between me and my own foyer. Not always Jessica called it a security thing with the holidays coming, but enough times that my knuckle bruised from knocking. Once, on my way to fix the storm window latches before the cold snap, I stood on the porch with my tool bag while I heard them bustling in the kitchen, music playing, dog barking at a neighbor's lab. The life of my house on the other side of a lock. Danny opened up looking rattled, apologized, and waved me in. I fixed the latches. Jessica thanked me as if I were a service call. She handed me a bottle of water on my way out and said she'd Venmo me for materials. I told her I didn't accept tips. Thanksgiving offered a preview of Christmas in miniature. The table I built 3 coats of polyurethane. Not one ring in 30 years vanished under a rented linen tablecloth and charger plates that looked like medieval shields. I was invited to carve the turkey at 4 o'clock and asked to head back to the cottage by 6 because Jessica's parents had a tradition of after-dinner board games as a family of origin. I asked, softly, "What am I?" She said, smiling, "Immediate family. Means the core unit, Walter." I looked at Danny. He looked at his plate. I started keeping a notebook. Not to weaponize, just to keep myself honest about what was happening. Dates, small changes, things said. A contractor's punch list for a relationship under renovation without permits. On a Tuesday, my lawnmower gas can relocated to a locked deck box. Emma wasn't allowed near it. Good rule for gas. The lock was overkill. On a Thursday, the kids' schedule slid under my cottage door drop-offs. Naps, piano, gymnastics highlighted in a color that meant do not disturb. On a Saturday, I found a motion sensor porch light installed at the back door that clicked on whenever I crossed the yard at night to take out my trash, flooding my path in cold LED and reminding the cameras, I assumed there were cameras, that Grandpa was moving. The small humiliations gathered force. My mail, still addressed to my home, metastasized into a bin labeled Dad, sort before bringing over. A week went by where I signed for 3 deliveries and never saw what they contained. The freezer inventory list taped to the garage door earned me a note about not touching the French vanilla ice cream. Sarah's treat, written in Jessica's handwriting. I would never take a child's dessert, but the note told me who belonged and who borrowed. Even the grandparenting became scheduled theater. Walter, the kids are better in short bursts. Let's limit sweets, no roughhousing. Jake gets overstimulated. Please approve reading material in advance. Some of the old books reinforce gender roles. I'm not a man who argues with a mother about her children, but the day she edited the little engine that could to the engine that persisted, I went for a walk and counted to 100 slowly. And still I tried to make grace. I fixed what broke. I kept my comments small. I brought over soup when flu ran through the house. I replaced the igniter in the oven the morning of a school bake sale. I shoveled the walk at dawn before anyone woke to see it done. I praised Jessica when she found a bargain on winter coats. I told Danny he was a good dad. I let the dog out when they ran late. I waited for a thank you that came often enough to keep me from hardening completely. The last switch flipped in December, though I felt the wiring buzzing long before. The tree went up without me. My star found a plastic tote. The children practiced a little song for the school pageant, and I heard it through the wall instead of kneeling in front of them with my hands folded like a church pew. The house smelled like cinnamon and orange peels, and I smelled it from the cold. I kept remembering the paper I'd written at move-in. Utilities on your meter. Lawn on me. Keep Margaret's things where they are. Consult the 4 major changes. Remember, still my house. Somewhere along the way, that last line had faded to invisible ink. Each new rule call first. Text always. Don't enter during nap. Wait on the porch had been a light sanding, a single pass with fine grit. You don't notice the shape changing until your hand slides over an edge and finds it foreign dot the week before Christmas. Jessica slid one more. Policy across my figurative desk. Parking. Could I move my truck around the corner while her parents were in town so the driveway looked tidy? And if it wasn't too much trouble, could I leave the side gate latched during their stay? Her father spooks easily at night. I said yes to the truck. I said I'd try with the gate. Then I walked back to the cottage and sat with Margaret's quilt across my knees, the one Jessica had called heavy, and realized weight is what keeps a thing from blowing away. I don't mind being needed. I mind being managed in the home I built, thanked as if I'm a contractor billing by the quarter hour, and permitted to love my grandchildren according to a schedule that treats me like a hazard to be mitigated. Control doesn't announce itself. With a slammed door, it slides a bolt quietly and tells you it's for your own good. By the time Christmas Eve came and Jessica stood in my doorway with her gentle voice and her firm boundary about immediate family, I had already done the math. The sum of 1,000 little edits is a red pencil through a man's name. That night, I decided to pick up my pen. Walter. As Christmas approached, I was looking forward to spending the holidays with my grandchildren. Emma was 7, Jake was 5, and little Sarah was 2. Christmas had always been Margaret's favorite holiday, and I wanted to continue the traditions we'd established over the years. Walter. I'd already bought presents for all the kids and was planning to help Danny set up the Christmas tree in the living room, the same spot where Margaret and I had put our tree for 20 years. I was excited about making Christmas morning special for the grandchildren, Walter, but Jessica had other plans. 3 weeks before Christmas, she announced that her parents would be coming to stay for the holidays. She said they'd be sleeping in the guest room and that Christmas dinner would be just family. Walter. When I asked about the Christmas morning gift exchange, Jessica said, "Oh, Walter, we're going to do that early, just with the kids. Then, we'll have a nice quiet dinner with my parents. You understand how it is with house guests. We need to keep things simple." Walter. I didn't understand. I was being excluded from Christmas in my own house while Jessica's parents were being welcomed as honored guests. But I didn't want to cause problems for Danny, so I kept my mouth shut. Walter. A week before Christmas, Jessica's demands became even more unreasonable. She asked me to move my car out of the driveway so her parents would have a place to park. She suggested that I might want to make myself scarce during their visit so the house wouldn't feel crowded. Walter. Jessica actually said, "Walter, I know this is hard for you, but my parents aren't used to this kind of living situation. They might feel uncomfortable knowing you're right outside in the cottage. Maybe you could visit your sister for a few days?" Walter. She wanted me to leave my own property so her parents wouldn't be uncomfortable knowing that the homeowner was nearby. The audacity was breathtaking. By the first week of December, the yard smelled like cold bark and wet leaves, and I had the ladder out to check the gutters the way I always did before the first real snow. That chore was mine before they moved into the house, and I kept it mine afterward, even when Jessica suggested hiring a service because it looked more professional. I told her I trusted my hands and the ladder I'd sanded smooth years ago. She gave me a tight smile that said, "Have it your way," and went back inside to adjust a wreath that cost more than the last circular saw I bought. I started laying out the season the way Margaret and I always had: small, steady, simple. A box of ornaments in the cottage, the old wooden nativity carved by her uncle, a roll of twine for popcorn garlands I planned to string with the kids. I sharpened a little pocket knife for whittling name tags out of cedar shingles. My part was ready. All I needed was time with the family in the main house. The calendar told a different story. I saw it first as a printed schedule on the fridge when I stopped by to return Jake's backpack. Jessica had made a color-coded grid. School. Rehearsals in green, neighborhood events in blue, playdates in purple, visits with her parents in red. There were red blocks everywhere: airport pickup, pre-Christmas brunch, cookie swap, candlelight service, gift opening. I looked for our old anchors and found them ghosted out. Tree trimming had moved to a Tuesday evening while I was at my woodworkers. Club, Gingerbread Saturday, was now a private tradition with her mother. The Sunday we always spent untangling light strands together had been repurposed as a brunch with friends, who would describe as like family. I brought in the box of ornaments I'd set aside for the kids' felt snowmen, clothespin reindeer, the paper stars Emma and I made 2 years ago. Jessica suggested we keep the tree minimalist this year to suit the new living room palette. She said the children could decorate the smaller tree in the playroom. I didn't argue. I asked if I could do the lights, since I know exactly how that tree likes to be wrapped. She said the decorator from her workplace had given her a new technique, and it would be easier if she handled it. The kids were excited about everything and excited about nothing for long. They raced to the cottage each afternoon after school, bursting with news: a class secret Santa, a choir solo, a wish list suddenly amended after a commercial. I kept a notepad on the counter and wrote down the little things that mattered: toy dinosaurs with movable jaws, a puzzle map, and the book about a train that goes through the night. Later, Jessica texted a shared online registry and asked kindly enough that we stick to it to avoid duplicates. I noticed it was full of muted woods and matching sets and curated play. None of it wrong. Not much of it the kids' actual Christmas. I found my Christmas in motion more than in things. I fixed the wobbly banister so small feet could fly safely down on the morning of, and I freshened the pine boughs along the porch with sprigs from the back fence. I tuned the old turntable and cleaned the needles so the records would sound warm again. I oiled the front door hinges because they'd begun to complain, and no one's entrance on Christmas ought to squeal. I asked Danny when we were putting up the old star. He said we could figure that out later. Jessica had purchased a clean-line topper that matched the ribbon. Jessica's parents were due in the week before Christmas. The guest room was made up like a hotel suite: fresh paint, new linens, a little tray with bottled water and chocolates. I saw a note on the counter that read, "Plan for early dinner, minimal spice, no garlic for Dad." I stayed aside when they arrived, not because I wasn't welcome exactly, but because the house filled fast and I have learned to read the air. Jessica's mother waved from the doorway. Her father shook my hand once in the hall and mentioned how chilly the cottage must be. I told him the heater does its job. He said he preferred central heat. I said the cottage is that to do my part in the season narrowed to errands and repairs. I picked up the last-minute wrapping paper order from the craft store when their delivery window slid into a school recital. I assembled the new train set late one night at the dining table and left it in perfect loops around the legs so the children would have something magical at breakfast. Jessica texted a thank you with a train emoji. Danny called and said he'd be home late. Could I move the bins of decorations back to the garage? I did it all with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent 40 years making things feel effortless for the people he loves. The plan for Christmas seemed simple on paper, complicated in practice. There would be a Christmas Eve dinner after, the children's pageant, then hot cocoa and a movie, then stockings in the morning, gift opening, a walk in the afternoon if the weather held, and dinner with her parents again. When I asked where I fit, Jessica said we play it by ear given all the moving parts. I told her my hearing is still good when it comes to family. I tried to carve out something that felt like ours. I suggested we trim the playroom tree together, just me and the kids, and she agreed. We put on a record, strung the popcorn garland I'd carried over in a tin, and let the rules relax. Emma placed the paper star she'd made years before at the top, and Jake hung 3 ornaments on the same branch until it drooped and then laughed as I pretended the tree was sighing. That hour was the truest thing I'd felt in their house all month. Jessica peeked in at the end and said it looked sweet. Sweet is the word people use for a thing they won't fight for dot with each day. The boundaries tightened like shoelaces tugged too hard. I was asked to park on the street so her parents could have the driveway. The doorbell was swapped for a smart chime that sent a notification when anyone approached. I tested it once to make sure it worked and received a polite text reminding MD to use the side entrance while guests were in residence. I started bringing my gifts to the cottage by the armload at dusk to keep them separate, not because anyone demanded it, but because I could feel how my things made the curated picture look messy. 2 nights before Christmas, I sat at the cottage table and wrapped, slow and careful. I tucked cedar shavings into each box because that smell is the closest thing I have to Margaret's December. I labeled the tags in my best carpenter's print. Then I wrote cards, not long, just true about the ways each child grew this year that made me proud. I slid cash into Danny's envelope because I remember what young bills feel like right after the holidays. For Jessica, I chose a gift card to a store she liked and a voucher for a deep clean I'd already booked with a crew I trust. I thought about writing a note, then decided the best note would be leaving her be. The afternoon of Christmas Eve, I ironed a shirt and set my watch 10 minutes fast. I left early to catch the children's pageant and found a seat on the aisle where they could see me without looking too far. Jake spotted me first and waved both arms like he was guiding a plane. He sang out of time, louder than everyone else, which is the best way to sing at 6. Emma was a shepherd with a blue scarf and steady eyes. I clapped until my palms stung. On the way out, I bent to tell them how proud I was and to meet at the house for cocoa and cookies like we always did. Jessica smiled and said there was a plan for the evening already, and we would sort out another time. I walked back across the yard after dark. The living room's big window glowed gold. Shadow shapes moved on the wall branches from the tree. Hands lifting mugs, the dog's wagging tail beating time against someone's leg. I stood a minute with my gifts in my hands, feeling foolish and feeling stubborn, both. I told myself to go in anyway, to offer help with coats and boots, to set logs in the fireplace and make sure the flue was open. When I reached the door, I paused. A new doormat lay where the old one used to be. It read welcome in a font that looked handwritten if you've never seen a handwrite. I wiped my boots, straightened my shoulders, and knocked. Somewhere in another room, Someone laughed. Somewhere behind me, the cold carried pine and far-off smoke. I waited for a long breath and then for the one after it, and thought about how a man prepares for a season that may no longer include him, even as it takes place in the rooms he built. What I didn't know yet was how exact my preparation would need to be. I had my gifts wrapped, my errands run, my chores finished. I had stories in my head about Margaret's first Christmas roast and the year the tree fell, and we righted it with twine anchored to a screw eye in the ceiling. I had a sentence ready for Jessica that said, "I love how you make things beautiful." I had a sentence ready for Danny that said, "I am here when you need a hand." I had nothing ready for the one sentence that mattered, the one that would take the season, the house, the whole arrangement, and turn it into a choice I should have made sooner. On the sill by the cottage sink sat the star they didn't use. I had dusted it and set it there 2 days earlier without thinking. It caught the porch light just enough to throw a small reflection on the glass. I looked at that reflection before. I knocked again, and I understood the truth of my December. I had been rehearsing the wrong part. The setup was complete. All that remained was to see who counted me in and who pretended I was background, and then to decide what a man does when he's written out of a holiday in a house that still carries his name on the deed. Walter. Christmas. Eve arrived, and Jessica's parents had been in the house for 2 days. I'd barely seen my grandchildren because Jessica was keeping them busy with special activities for their other grandparents. I felt like a stranger on my own property. Walter. That evening, I knocked on the front door of my own house to ask if I could say goodnight to the kids. Jessica answered the door, but didn't invite me in. She stood in the doorway like a bouncer at a nightclub. "Walter," Jessica said. "Walter, the kids are already in their pajamas, and we're having a quiet family evening. Maybe you could see them tomorrow after my parents leave." I could hear laughter and Christmas music coming from inside from the living room where I'd spent countless Christmas Eves with Margaret. "Walter," I asked Jessica if I could at least give the kids their Christmas presents, since I wouldn't be seeing them on Christmas morning. That's when she delivered the news that would change everything. "Walter," Jessica said. "Actually, Walter, we've decided to have a small, intimate Christmas this year. Just immediate family. My parents flew all the way from Florida, and we want to focus on them. You understand, don't you? We'll do something with you next week, Walter." I stood there on the porch of my own house, being told by my daughter-in-law that I wasn't immediate family. The woman who'd been living in my house rent-free for 3 years was banning me from Christmas because I wasn't important enough to include. "Walter," I asked to speak to Danny, but Jessica said he was busy getting the kids ready for bed. She said, "Walter, please don't make this difficult. We'll call you after Christmas and set up a time to exchange gifts. This is just how it has to be this year." "Walter," I walked back to the cottage, sat in my chair, and looked at the wrapped presents I'd bought for my grandchildren. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt completely alone. And that's when I decided that Jessica had finally gone too far. Dusk fell early and clean that evening. The kind of thin winter dark that makes every window look like a lantern. I crossed the yard with the gifts balanced in a banker's box, the cardboard warm from the cottage heater and my hands. From the living room, I could hear a children's choir on the television, voices drifting through a crack in the storm window like breath on glass. Somewhere a timer dinged in the kitchen. Somewhere a cork popped, followed by that bright talk people use when they're pretending to be easy with one another. I set the box at my feet and wiped my boots on the new welcome mat. Up close, the letters were crisp and machine perfect. I thought about the old bristle mat that used to live here, the one Margaret bought from a flea market because the O had faded into a heart. Jessica had tossed it in the fall under the heading of refresh. That word can do a lot of damage if you let it. I knocked once, light, a courtesy for a door I paid for twice over once when I hung it. Again, when I refinished it after a leak in '98. A shadow shifted in the hall. The latch clicked, then paused, as if the door itself had something to decide. When it opened, Jessica filled the space with the kind of smile people use to warn you back from the edge of a pool. "We're settling in for a quiet family night," she said. "The kids are in their pajamas. Maybe tomorrow would be better." I looked past her shoulder. The tree threw its glittering nets across the ceiling. The mantle garland was new and expensive, all eucalyptus and white berries, instead of the cedar I tucked there every year. On the far wall, the silhouettes of two small heads moved in front of the television, and when one of them tilted, the lights from the tree ran like spilled stars across a child's hair. I kept my tone level. "I'm only here to say goodnight," and dropped these off. "They've been asking about the cedar tags all week. Won't take a minute." She stepped into the frame of the door and held it there with a hand on the knob. A practiced position, gentle and immovable. "We're trying something different this year," she said. "A smaller, more intimate evening. Just immediate family." Her eyes flicked to the box, to the ribbons I tied with a miller's knot because it holds without biting. "Perhaps next week. We can have a little moment with you. We'll call. There are sentences a man expects he'll never have to answer on his own porch." I took one breath to steady myself. Another to choose not to cause a scene my grandchildren would remember. I met the angle of her jaw instead of her eyes because I didn't trust my face and said I'd at least like to hand the gifts to the children at the threshold. She shook her head with an apology that lived only in the shape of the word. "They're getting settled. We don't want to wind them up. Thank you for understanding. Understanding is a heavy coat. You can put it on and still freeze." I asked to speak to Danny. She said he was busy getting stockings arranged. And then she added something about flow, as if families were water features that required planned channels and hidden pumps. The polite smile again, and the smallest. Push the door could make without being called a shove. From inside came the sharp, bright yip of the dog, greeting someone bearing cookies. The high note of a grandmother's laugh, the silent thunder of children running in slippers. I pictured the landing halfway up the stairs, the place where Margaret used to pause and call back down that she'd forgotten the extra tape, and I thought about how sound moves around the house like water through a familiar creek bed. That was the first moment I felt like a rock someone had rolled aside to sharpen the flow. I set the box down on the porch bench. We built the summer the kids planted sunflowers. Cold crept through my solace and into the bones of my feet. The porch light haloed the air, catching bits of frost mid-flight. I tried one last line, the quiet one, then speak to people they refuse to hate. Let them know I came by. Tell them I love them. She said of course and closed the door with care, a courtesy extended like a receipt proof of transaction, not of gratitude. The door snicked into the latch. The new smart lock sang its little security song. I was left with the hum of the porch light and the soft thud of my own heart. It is a strange thing to stand outside the house you raised your son in and feel like a delivery driver who missed his window. Back at the cottage, I set the box on the table and touched each tag the way a carpenter runs his thumb along fresh joinery. The cedar scent rose and folded into the room's warm dust and old coffee. I sat without taking off my coat. Across the yard, the living room flared brighter. Someone must have switched off the lamps and turned up the tree for effect. The window became a storybook. The silhouettes became characters, familiar and suddenly far away. I could almost read their lips and almost hear the lines, a language I knew by heart when I was allowed inside it. I am not a man given to bitterness. 40 years in the trades teaches you that wood only splits the way the grain tells it to. You don't fight oak when it wants to cup. You plane with the truth of it. But there's another truth. Every shop has a saw you must retire before it hurts someone. That's how the thought of leaving came to me, not as revenge, not as a tantrum, but as a safety measure, a guard in place, a hand off the switch. The evening stretched. I'd put on a record Margaret loved because the room needed a voice that didn't ask anything of me. I poured cocoa into the heavy mug the kids call the bear cup because of the chip that made a little ear. I watched steam rise and tried to find a way to slide this night into a drawer where it wouldn't jam the next time I pulled for peace dot at 8. My phone buzzed. A photo from Danny Emma in a red nightgown, Jake in plaid pants, both holding a plate of cookies near the tree. No caption. No invitation to walk the 20 yards between our doors. I stared at the picture long enough for the screen to dim, then brighten, then dim again. One typed and erased 5 different replies before settling on a single word: beautiful. He hearted it and did not call. The phone went face down on the table as if it could hear itself. I stood and walked to the cottage window that faces the back of the house. Beyond the glass, the oak I planted the year Danny was born reached black fingers into the sky. In another life, I would have been inside telling the story about that tree, how the root ball was twice the size the nursery said, how I bribed a neighbor with a 6-pack to help me lever it into the hole, how Margaret brought lemonade and said we're planting shade for someone else. I let the memory land and leave. A man can tilt toward the past until his present is a blank page. Footsteps on the gravel. I turned, hope rising too fast. Not Danny. The neighbor cutting through to drop off a tin of peppermint bark they deliver up and down the street every year. They left it at my door with a cheery knock, unaware of the small theater taking place 2 doors down in which I did not have a part. I called a thank you through the wood and placed the tin next to the box of gifts that no longer had a destination. Little after 9, car doors thunked and voices moved toward the driveway. Her parents heading to the late service at their church, I figured. The headlights swung across the cottage window, and for a moment, I could see my own reflection laid over the living room behind it. 2 worlds occupying the same square of glass without touching. I raised a hand to no one in particular and then let it fall. The light washed away, and with it the last of the thought that maybe I'd be called in for a cocoa. A quick tuck in, a kiss on a sleepy head. Tired will do strange things to a man's temper. It can make you wild or it can make you precise. Years of blueprints trained me for the latter. I took out the folder where I keep papers people forget. I keep deed copies, tax receipts, the note from the accountant who ran numbers on the homestead exemption. I laid them out on the table as if I were building a case against a wall I intended to move. My hands were steady. My breath was calm. There was no hurry, only a sense that the next cut had to be clean. The house hummed on the other side of the glass. In my room, the clock ticked like a metronome set a fraction too slow. I gathered the gifts again, not because I thought I'd be allowed to carry them through that front door, but because a grandfather still moves toward his grandchildren even when the path is blocked. I set aside the envelopes for the kids and slid them into a drawer I labeled in pencil. I left Danny's envelope on the table in the center, visible and unmissable. A small square of goodwill in a room I was leaving behind in more ways than one. Close to 10, my phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Jessica that read thanks for understanding. The words sat on the screen without weight, and yet they pressed on the room all the same. I powered the phone down. Silence returned like an old friend who doesn't ask where you've been. I stepped outside into the cold because the night needed fresh air. Frost had silvered the lawn. The children's boot prints from earlier that afternoon had frozen into perfect fossils of joy. I traced one with my toe the way a man might trace a name on a headstone, gentle so as not to disturb what's sacred. From the chimney, a thin thread of smoke lifted into the sky and unspooled. I thought of the years I'd kept that flue clean so nights like this would be sweet and safe. Then I thought of the workshop, now a playroom, soon someone else's. problem and realized the maintenance I owed, the care I gave, had been converted into decor and rules and a door held arm's length. I went back inside. I washed the single mug I dirtied, dried it with the good towel Margaret embroidered with a crooked pine, and hung it straight. I turned off the record player and slid the vinyl into its sleeve like you lay down a sleeping child. I checked the thermostat in that automatic way old men do and smiled when it responded to my hand with a soft click. Then I sat, picked up a pen, and wrote a list with 2 columns: things to keep, things to let go. Under let go, I wrote the sentence that would carry me into the morning. The idea that you must ask permission to be a part of what you built. Midnight came and went without carols. Across the yard, the lights dimmed, then went out, then came back to a gentle glow, the way people leave a tree onto nightlight their memories. In the cottage, I turned off the lamp and let the dark be honest. Some moments need a clean edge to cut what binds you to the wrong arrangement. Sleep took its time. When it finally came, it arrived with a clarity that felt like sunrise. I would not knock at that door again, to ask for a place in my own house. Morning would come, and with it whatever a man does when he has been told he is not immediate family in the rooms he framed. I had a phone, a number, and a name already forming on my tongue. Before that, I had the quiet gift of a decision made without anger, forged on the anvil of a cold Christmas Eve. Outside, a fox crossed the yard, silent as a secret. Inside, the cottage held steady, and so did I plus Walter. I spent Christmas Eve alone in the cottage, listening to the sounds of celebration coming from my own house. I could hear the kids laughing, adults talking, and Christmas music playing. It was the Christmas I should have been part of, in the house I owned, with the grandchildren I adored. Walter, that night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my real estate agent, Linda Morrison, and left a message asking her to come see me the day after Christmas. I told her I was ready to sell the house. Walter, Christmas morning, I watched from my cottage window as Jessica's parents loaded their car with presents and luggage. The kids were playing in the yard with new toys, but Jessica made sure they stayed away from the cottage. I wasn't allowed to participate in Christmas morning in my own home. Walter, Danny finally came to see me around noon, looking guilty and uncomfortable. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry about yesterday. Jessica just wanted everything to be perfect for her parents. You know how she gets when she's stressed." Walter, I told Danny that I understood and that I'd made a decision about the house. I said, "Son, I've been thinking about downsizing for a while now. This house is too big for me, and I think it's time to sell it and move into something smaller." Walter, Danny looked panicked. He said, "Dad, you can't sell the house. Where will we live? We can't afford to buy a place, and the rental market is crazy expensive right now." I told him that I was sure he and Jessica would figure something out. Walter, I explained to Danny that I'd given them 3 years to get back on their feet financially, but instead of saving money for their own place, they'd gotten comfortable living in my house for free. It was time for them to take responsibility for their own housing. Walter, Danny begged me to reconsider, promising that Jessica would be more respectful in the future. But I told him that respect shouldn't be something I had to beg for in my own home. The decision was made. Walter, Linda, Morrison came to see me on December 26th, and we walked through the house while Jessica and her family were out shopping. Linda said the house would sell quickly in the current market, probably for around $340,000. Walter, I told Linda that I wanted a fast sale with a 60-day closing. I was ready to move on with my life, and I wanted Danny and Jessica to have enough time to find alternative housing, but not enough time to try to manipulate me into changing my mind. Walter, the house went on the market on December 28th. Within a week, we had 3 offers, all at or above asking price. I accepted an offer from a young couple who wanted to close in 45 days. Walter. Jessica was furious when she found out the house was under contract. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of putting my grandchildren on the street out of spite. She said I was punishing the kids for her mistakes. Walter. I told Jessica that I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply selling my house. I reminded her that she'd made it clear I wasn't immediate family, so my housing decisions shouldn't affect her immediate family. Walter. Jessica tried every manipulation tactic she could think of. She cried, she raged, she threatened to keep the grandchildren away from me. She even suggested that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and shouldn't be making major decisions. Walter. But I was thinking more clearly than I had in years. For 3 years, I've been a prisoner in my own cottage while Jessica controlled my house and my access to my grandchildren. The Christmas banishment had been the final straw. Walter. Danny was caught between his wife's demands and his father's decision. He tried to negotiate with me, offering to pay rent or to set up a schedule for my visits to the house. But it was too late for compromises. Walter. With only 6 weeks to find new housing, Danny and Jessica went into panic mode. They'd gotten so comfortable living rent-free that they hadn't saved any money for a security deposit or down payment on their own place. Walter. Jessica started calling rental agencies, but quickly discovered that finding a 4-bedroom house in their price range was nearly impossible. Most landlords wanted first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit money that Danny and Jessica didn't have. Walter. Jessica's parents offered to help with moving expenses, but they couldn't afford to bankroll a rental deposit and monthly rent for a family of 5. Jessica's expensive tastes had finally caught up with her financial reality. Walter. Danny picked up extra work to try to raise money for a rental deposit, but time was running out. The closing date was approaching, and they still hadn't found a place they could afford. Walter. Jessica made one last desperate attempt to change my mind. She brought the kids to the cottage and had them ask me not to sell their house. It was emotional manipulation at its worst, using my grandchildren as weapons in her war against my decision. Walter. I told the kids that Grandpa was moving to a smaller house and that they'd be moving to a new house too. I explained that sometimes families have to make changes, but that I'd always loved them no matter where they lived. Walter. Jessica was furious that her manipulation hadn't worked. She said, Walter, you're destroying this family out of petty revenge. These children will never forgive you for making them homeless. Walter. I reminded Jessica that I wasn't making anyone homeless. I was simply selling my house. If she'd spent the last 3 years saving money instead of redecorating and controlling my access to my own home, they'd have options. Walter. The closing took place on February 15th, exactly 7 weeks after Jessica banned me from Christmas. I walked out of the lawyer's office with a check for $340,000 and the satisfaction of knowing that I was finally free from Jessica's control. Walter. Danny and Jessica had found a rental house at the last minute, a smaller, older place in a less desirable neighborhood. The rent was $2,200 a month, which was a significant strain on Danny's electrician's salary. Walter. Moving day was chaotic and stressful for Jessica's family. They'd accumulated a lot of stuff during their 3 years in my house, and much of it wouldn't fit in their new, smaller place. Jessica had to sell furniture and belongings to make everything fit. Walter. I helped Danny with the move, loading boxes and furniture into the rental truck. It was hard work for a 71-year-old man, but I wanted to show my son that I wasn't abandoning him. I was just reclaiming my independence. Walter. Jessica barely spoke to me during the move. When she did, it was to make sarcastic comments about how I must be happy to see them struggle. But I wasn't happy about their struggle. I was happy about my freedom. Walter. The new owners of my house were a young couple with a baby on the way. They were excited about starting their family in the house where I raised Danny and spent 20 years with Margaret. It felt good knowing that the house would be filled with love again, instead of resentment and control. Walter, I used part of the money from the sale to buy a nice 2-bedroom condo in a senior community about 20 minutes away. It was the perfect size for me, with a small workshop space and a community center where I could socialize with people my own age. Walter, the rest of the money went into investments and a trust fund for my grandchildren's education. I figured that was a better use of my resources than subsidizing Jessica's lifestyle while being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home. Walter, the first few months after the move were difficult for everyone. Danny was working overtime to afford the rent. Jessica was struggling to adjust to their smaller house, and the kids missed having Grandpa next door. Walter, Jessica tried to blame me for all their problems. She'd tell people that I'd kicked out my own family and made my grandchildren homeless. But the truth was that I'd given them 3 years of free housing, and they'd use that time to take me for granted, instead of planning for their future. Walter, Danny and I maintained our relationship, though it was strained at first. He'd bring the kids to visit me at my new condo, and we'd go to parks or out for ice cream. Jessica rarely came along, which was fine with me. Walter, about 6 months after the move, Danny came to see me alone. He looked exhausted from working so much overtime, and he seemed older than his 35 years. That's when he finally admitted what I'd been waiting to hear. Walter, Danny said, "Dad, I owe you an apology. Jessica was wrong to ban you from Christmas, and I was wrong to let her do it. You gave us a place to live when we had nowhere else to go, and we repaid your generosity by treating you like an outsider in your own home." Walter, I told Danny that I appreciated his apology, but that the real lesson was about respect and boundaries. I said, "Son, when someone does you a favor, you don't get to control how they live their life." Jessica forgot that it was my house, not hers. Walter, Danny asked if there was any way we could rebuild our family relationship. I told him that I'd always love him and the grandchildren, but that Jessica would need to earn back my respect through her actions, not her words. Walter, it's been 2 years since I sold the house, and our family dynamics have completely changed. Danny and Jessica are still struggling financially, but they're learning to live within their means instead of depending on my generosity. Walter, Jessica has never apologized for banning me from Christmas or for trying to control my access to my own home. But she's learned to be more respectful when we do interact, probably because she realizes that I'm no longer dependent on her goodwill to see my grandchildren. Walter, I spend Christmas with Danny and the kids now, but at my condo or at a restaurant-neutral territory where Jessica can't control the guest list. The kids love visiting Grandpa's new place, and they don't seem traumatized by the move, like Jessica predicted. Walter, the money from the house sale has given me financial security and independence. I can afford to take the grandchildren on trips, pay for their activities, and help with their education, all without having to ask Jessica's permission or endure her criticism. Walter, people sometimes ask me if I regret selling the house and forcing my son's family to move. The answer is no. I regret that it took me 3 years to stand up for myself, but I don't regret reclaiming my dignity and independence. Walter, Jessica learned that free housing comes with the expectation of basic respect and gratitude. You can't ban the homeowner from Christmas dinner and expect to keep living in his house rent-free. Walter, Danny learned that enabling his wife's disrespectful behavior toward his father has consequences. He lost 3 years of free housing because he couldn't stand up to Jessica when she was clearly in the wrong. Walter, as for me, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop letting them take advantage of you. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. Walter, the house that Jessica thought she controlled, is now home to a young family who appreciates what they have. And the man she tried to push aside is now living independently, with his dignity intact and his bank account healthy. Walter, Jessica wanted an intimate Christmas with just immediate family. She got exactly what she asked for, a family that's now intimately familiar with paying their own rent and solving their own problems. Walter, sometimes the best Christmas gift you can give yourself is freedom from people who take your generosity for granted. And sometimes the best gift you can give your ungrateful family members is a lesson in consequences. Walter, I may not live next door to my grandchildren anymore, but I see them regularly on my terms, in my space, with the respect I deserve. And that's worth more than any house.